Night settles over a Boston ward at the turn of a new century. Linens bleached bone-white, a clock that never stops ticking, and a row of metal beds that echo every breath. The air smells of carbolic and coal smoke. Nurses glide between patients with measured steps and quiet voices, promising relief in careful doses. Most of them are exhausted. One of them is energized. They call her Jolly Jane. She laughs easily, remembers birthdays, tucks blankets under tired chins. If fear can be charmed, she charms it. If pain can be soothed, she soothes it. Hand on the wrist, voice like a lullaby. She is the last face many see before sleep, and lately, sleep seems to come quickly. On this winter night, a young man grips the bedrail, shivering through fever. The nurse leans in, cheerful as ever. "Just something to help," she murmurs. Glass clinks. A clear liquid slides into the vein, slow and certain. His eyes flutter. Relief washes over him like a tide, then pulls back farther than it should. Another nurse across the room glances up at the sudden stillness and, for a heartbeat, the ward forgets how to breathe. A whisper drifts from bed to bed, passed like contraband through dry mouths. "Have you noticed? The ones she watches, they don't wake up." But who could suspect the woman who hums to herself while changing sheets? Who would question the nurse who volunteers for the worst night shifts? Who sits bedside long after others have gone? In a world where medicine hurts almost as often as it heals, where death walks hospital corridors with impunity, it's easy to confuse kindness with safety. It's easy to believe that a smile is a shield. Soon a pattern emerges, quiet, efficient, devastating. Patients who should improve slip away. Friends outside the ward grow ill after a visit. Families stagger under back-to-back funerals. And still the same bright, bustling figure moves through rooms like a guardian angel. Only later will the truth find its voice. Some angels do not save. Some angels choose who sleeps and who never wakes. You're watching the story of Jane Toppan, nurse, comforter, confidant, and by her own admission, a woman who enjoyed watching life depart. Let's step back to a country learning medicine by trial and error, and to the perfect storm that let a killer hide in plain sight. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was a nation straddling two worlds, one foot in the horse-drawn past, the other in the machine age. Cities swelled with immigrants, streets buzzed with electric trolleys, and factories clanged through the night. Yet inside the hospitals, medicine remained a precarious science. Doctors prescribed opium as casually as aspirin. Germ theory was still young, sterilization inconsistent, and dosages often guessed more than measured. In this gray zone between progress and guesswork, patients placed their faith not just in physicians, but in the women who worked closest to them, the nurses. Nursing, shaped by Florence Nightingale only a few decades earlier, was considered an honorable calling. Nurses were expected to be dutiful, disciplined, and self-sacrificing. Many families saw them as guardian figures, women who carried not only medicine but moral authority. If a nurse said a patient was in good hands, families believed her. This blind trust created both safety and danger. Regulations for nurses were minimal. Hospitals lacked strict oversight, and background checks were nearly unheard of. In smaller communities, a recommendation and a cheerful demeanor were often enough to secure employment in the most intimate of roles, caretaker of the sick and dying. At the same time, pain was managed with powerful, poorly controlled substances. Morphine, derived from opium, was widely used to ease suffering, as was atropine, a drug that could slow the heart and blur the line between calm and collapse. In skilled hands, they could comfort. In careless hands, they could kill. In cruel hands, they could be weapons. Patients entered wards already frightened of illness. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, typhoid. Diseases we control today could strike swiftly, and survival was never guaranteed. Families often accepted death as an all-too-common guest in the home. So when a patient failed to recover, even if their condition had seemed mild, few raised an eyebrow. This was the stage upon which Jane Toppan would perform. A country that revered nurses, a profession still defining itself, a system riddled with gaps wide enough to hide a predator. In a society so eager to believe in benevolent caretakers, It seemed unthinkable that one might exploit the role for her own desires. And into this landscape, Jane stepped, not yet a monster in the public eye, but a young woman with a fractured past, shaped long before her white uniform and cheerful smile became her disguise. Before she became Jolly Jane, she was Honora Kelly. Born in Boston in 1854, her earliest years were steeped in abandonment, poverty, and shadows that would cling to her for life. Her father, Peter Kelly, was a widowed Irish immigrant and a tailor by trade, but he was also deeply troubled. Neighbors whispered about his drinking, his violent temper, and his erratic behavior. Some later recalled that he was so unstable he once attempted to stitch his own eyelids closed, an act that earned him the nickname Kelly the Crack. When Honora was still a child, her mother died of tuberculosis, leaving her and her sisters in Peter's care, or rather, in his neglect. Within a few short years, Peter Kelly surrendered his children to the Boston Female Asylum, an institution meant for orphans and the unwanted. For Honora, it was a betrayal that etched itself into her developing mind. She was disposable. Life in the asylum was rigid and loveless. Children were rarely adopted. Instead, they were indentured, sent into homes as domestic servants. Honora was placed with the Toppan family in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Though never legally adopted, she took their surname and began calling herself Jane, a reinvention that hinted at her longing for identity and acceptance. But in the Toppan household, Jane was always the outsider. The family favored their biological daughter Elizabeth, while Jane remained a servant in all but name. Jealousy festered. She longed to belong, yet she also cultivated resentment toward those who did. That tension between a desire for intimacy and a hunger for control would become a defining part of her psyche. As Jane grew, she learned to mask her bitterness with charm. She developed a talent for storytelling, embellishing tales of her past, weaving lies that made her seem more important, more connected than she truly was. Those around her often found her entertaining, even likable. But beneath the cheerful exterior, psychologists later suggested, was a core wounded by rejection and fueled by an obsession with power. In these early years, Jane also began to blur lines between affection and domination. She craved closeness, but feared abandonment. To her, controlling another person's body and fate might have seemed like the ultimate form of security. No one could leave her if she held the keys to their life and death. By the time she reached adulthood, Jane had mastered the art of the facade. To acquaintances, she was warm, lively, and loyal. To herself, she was something far more complicated. A young woman with a hidden storm inside her, one that would only intensify once she discovered the tools of modern medicine. And soon, she would find her way into nursing school, where her dual identity, caretaker on the surface, predator beneath, would finally converge. By the 1880s, Jane had carefully molded herself into someone the world would welcome. With the Toppan name giving her a sense of legitimacy, she enrolled in the nursing program at Cambridge Hospital. It was here, in the long corridors filled with the smell of antiseptic and ether, that she found the perfect stage for her talents and her secrets. From the very beginning, Jane stood out. She was lively, witty, and quick to form friendships. Other nurses, often worn down by the endless demands of the job, admired her energy. Patients adored her cheerful demeanor. She would sing, tell stories, even sit by their bedsides to share a laugh. In a profession that demanded both skill and compassion, Jane seemed to embody both. Behind this mask of warmth, however, Jane was already experimenting, not yet with poisons, but with people. She studied how patients responded to her, how doctors trusted her, how quickly she could win over colleagues. She knew the value of charm, and she wielded it like a weapon. Even when she bent hospital rules or shirked responsibilities, her personality shielded her from consequences. One doctor later recalled that Jane's enthusiasm made her seem indispensable, and patients often requested her by name. This popularity granted her something rare in the medical world at the time: access. She had free rein of wards, drugs, and intimate patient care. She was not just another nurse, she was trusted. Yet there were small cracks that hinted at something darker. Jane had a fascination with autopsies. While other nurses might recoil from the grim reality of dissected bodies, Jane leaned in, watching intently, asking questions, taking note of how organs failed and how diseases left their marks. Death did not disturb her. If anything, it intrigued her. There were also whispers. Some colleagues thought she could be manipulative, twisting situations to her advantage. Others noticed her jealousy, especially toward those who seemed to have the wealth, love, or social standing she lacked. Still, no one saw danger in her. Why would they? She was Jolly Jane, always ready with a smile, always eager to help. This was the perfect camouflage. In a time when oversight was minimal and nurses operated on a foundation of trust, Jane had crafted the ideal persona. No one suspected that the same woman who held a patient's hand through their pain was already imagining how she might control their final breath. Her opportunity had arrived, and soon she would take the first irreversible step, transforming from a caretaker into a killer. The first time Jane Toppan decided to play with life itself, it wasn't out of mercy. It was out of curiosity. At Cambridge Hospital, she had access to a cabinet that held the power of gods, bottles of morphine and atropine, two drugs that sat side by side like opposites on a scale. Morphine dulled pain, slowed the body, and gently carried patients toward unconsciousness. Atropine did the reverse. It stimulated the heart, made it race, and could pull someone back from the brink, or push them past it. In precise doses, these drugs were miracles. In careless hands, they were accidents waiting to happen. In Jane's hands, they were tools for experimentation. Her method was simple but chilling. She would inject a patient with a combination of morphine and atropine, not to ease suffering, but to observe. She wanted to watch the body's response, the labored breathing, the sudden calm, the confusion in the eyes as consciousness slipped away. Then, sometimes she would administer the counter-drug, reviving her victim at the last moment, only to push them back down again. It was as though she had discovered a perverse theater, where she controlled the stage, the script, and the ending. Later, she admitted, it was a pleasure to watch them die. Her earliest victims were often the vulnerable, the elderly, the gravely ill, those already close to death. Their passing raised no alarm. Doctors assumed disease had run its course, families accepted loss as inevitable, and Jane walked away smiling. No one questioned the nurse who had been so attentive, so kind, so devoted, but Jane wasn't satisfied with inevitability. She escalated. She chose patients who should have recovered, men and women with minor ailments, treatable fevers, or simple infections. She would keep them company, chatting at their bedside, sometimes even climbing into bed with them to feel their final moments more intimately. To Jane, this was not murder in the heat of rage or desperation. This was an experiment in control, in dominance, in playing God with human lives. One patient, a woman recovering from surgery, had been improving steadily. Nurses expected her to go home within days, but under Jane's care, her condition mysteriously declined. Visitors later recalled how Jane insisted on staying by her side, monitoring every change. Within hours, the woman was dead. The doctors chalked it up to post-operative complications. Jane, behind her cheerful smile, knew otherwise. What made these early murders so invisible was the perfect storm of circumstances. Hospitals were overcrowded, deaths were common, and medical records were sparse. Unless foul play was obvious, no one suspected. And in Jane's case, there were never signs of struggle, never a trace of poison that could be easily detected with the crude tools of the time. Her victims simply stopped living. Each success emboldened her. She realized she could kill without consequence, that she could decide who lived and who died, and no one would ever know. The thrill was intoxicating. Soon, the act itself was no longer enough. She wanted to perfect it, to refine her techniques, and to savor the power. Jane had crossed a line she could never return from. She was no longer a nurse experimenting with doses. She was a predator who had discovered her appetite, and as the deaths around her mounted, so too did her confidence. She had found her calling, though it was one cloaked in darkness. And while patients saw only the smiling face of Jolly Jane, none could guess that their trusted nurse considered them subjects in her deadly game. Outside the hospital walls, Jane Toppan was not the cold-blooded manipulator we glimpse in her experiments. To friends and acquaintances, she was delightful company, the life of the gathering, a woman who could turn even the gloomiest evening into laughter. They called her Jolly Jane, because she was always smiling, always ready with a joke, always eager to share gossip over tea or beer. She dressed neatly, spoke with confidence, and carried herself as though she belonged in any room she entered. In an age when women were expected to be quiet and modest, Jane's boldness stood out. She was known for her sharp wit and her ability to make friends quickly. Few people, if any, suspected that beneath this cheerful facade lay a mind consumed by darkness. This ability to lead a double life was part of her genius. In the wards, she was trusted by doctors and beloved by patients. Beyond them, she was welcomed into homes, invited to social gatherings, and embraced as a friend. She had perfected the art of camouflage. But this outward persona wasn't just for survival. Jane enjoyed the thrill of deception. She liked knowing that she could move effortlessly between worlds, the kind nurse by day, the dutiful friend by night, and the secret executioner whenever she chose. It gave her a sense of superiority, as though she were playing a game that no one else even realized was underway. At times, her private and public lives brushed dangerously close together. Friends who confided in Jane later found themselves mysteriously ill. Acquaintances who trusted her with their ailments sometimes never recovered. Yet the pattern was impossible to detect, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. What makes Jane's story all the more chilling is how ordinary she seemed. A cheerful nurse, a sociable companion, a woman who appeared devoted to her patients and friends alike. She wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleys or a stranger with a weapon. She was someone people welcomed into their homes, someone they trusted with their lives, literally. And while they laughed with her, dined with her, and called her their friend, Jane was already calculating, already fantasizing about the next opportunity to indulge her darkest impulses. Her two lives were perfectly balanced, for now. But as her confidence grew, so too did her hunger. Soon, the smiling nurse would no longer be content with small experiments. She was ready for escalation. The experiments that had begun as curiosities soon transformed into something far more dangerous. Jane Toppan was no longer testing medicine. She was savoring murder. By the mid-1890s, her methods were refined, her confidence unshakable, and her appetite for control insatiable. She admitted years later that she derived a twisted thrill from watching her victims teeter between life and death. It was not enough simply to kill. She wanted to be present, to witness every heartbeat, every shudder, every final breath. The intimacy of those moments fed a craving she could no longer suppress. One of her techniques became particularly infamous. Jane would administer morphine to slow a patient's body, leaving them drowsy and helpless. Then she would inject atropine, sparking the heart into erratic rhythms. She described this balance like pulling the strings of a marionette, pushing and pulling, deciding whether her subject would survive or not. It was the act of playing God that excited her most. But her crimes were not limited to anonymous patients. Jane began targeting people in her social orbit, friends, landlords, even relatives of those she cared about. These were individuals who trusted her implicitly, never imagining that the cheerful nurse at their bedside was preparing their grave. To Jane, this trust was not sacred. It was an opportunity. In one chilling account, she poisoned a friend while simultaneously comforting her, whispering reassurances as the woman slipped into convulsions. Jane later confessed that she sometimes climbed into bed with her victims, holding them close as they died. She claimed it gave her a sense of intimacy, even passion. For Jane, murder was not merely an act of killing, it was a perverse substitute for affection, control masquerading as love. Her boldness grew. She killed not only when it was convenient, but when it was pleasurable. She admitted to sometimes sparing victims temporarily, reviving them just so she could extend the performance, dragging out their suffering for her own satisfaction. This was no longer about secrecy or experimentation. It was about indulgence. And yet, even as she racked up deaths, suspicion barely touched her. Medicine was imperfect, illnesses unpredictable, and mortality expected. A patient who declined suddenly was tragic but hardly shocking. Families mourned, doctors shrugged, and Jane moved on to her next target. By this point, she believed herself untouchable. She joked freely, lived socially, and wore the mask of Jolly Jane more convincingly than ever. But behind the laughter, her private journal of crimes grew darker. She wasn't just satisfied with killing the sick. She was beginning to set her sights on healthier, closer victims. Her need for control no longer respected boundaries. She wanted to decide not only who died, but when, how, and in whose arms. And as she escalated, her betrayals would cut deeper, striking those who had welcomed her into their homes and trusted her as one of their own. For Jane Toppan, death was not the end. It was her obsession, her thrill, her secret passion. And now, it was about to become personal. By the late 1890s, Jane Toppan's murders had moved beyond the hospital wards. She had perfected her methods, and her confidence urged her to test new boundaries. No longer content with anonymous patients whose deaths could be dismissed as medical misfortune, Jane began targeting people she knew intimately: friends, landlords, and even members of her adoptive family. These betrayals made her crimes all the more chilling. One of her earliest personal victims was her landlord, Israel Dunham, and his wife. Jane lived in their home and poisoned them both, carefully dosing them with her deadly concoctions. To the outside world, she appeared to be the devoted tenant who stayed by their side as they suffered. But in reality, she orchestrated their slow decline, savoring the control she held over their final days. Jane also set her sights on her foster family, particularly Elizabeth Brigham, the Toppans' biological daughter, the one Jane had always envied. Elizabeth had what Jane craved but never truly possessed: legitimacy, belonging, and stability. On the surface, the two women remained close, often spending time together. But beneath Jane's cheerful facade lay years of bitterness. In 1899, Jane invited Elizabeth to join her on a seaside holiday in Cape Cod. It seemed like a gesture of affection, a sisterly trip meant to bring them closer. Instead, it became a death sentence. During the outing, Jane prepared a drink laced with poison. Elizabeth fell violently ill, writhing as Jane watched with quiet satisfaction. When it was over, Jane had eliminated the woman she had resented since childhood. To the outside world, Elizabeth's sudden death seemed tragic but plausible. To Jane, it was a moment of twisted triumph. Her killings during this period revealed not only her cruelty, but also her contradictions. She murdered those she professed to love, yet she often stayed close as they died, offering comfort with one hand while tightening her grip with the other. Jane later confessed that these moments gave her profound pleasure, even describing them as emotionally and physically thrilling. But her betrayals did not stop with Elizabeth. Jane targeted others in her orbit, including her close friend Mary McNear, and several members of the Davis family, with whom she lodged after her foster sister's death. Each time, she wove herself deeper into the lives of her victims, earning their trust, only to exploit it in the most intimate and lethal way possible. By now, the body count had grown alarmingly high. Yet because her victims were scattered between hospitals, boarding houses, and family homes, the deaths did not form a pattern that was immediately obvious. Each tragedy seemed isolated, a cruel twist of fate rather than the work of a single calculating woman. Jane Toppan had crossed a new threshold. She was no longer just an opportunistic killer within the hospital system. She was an intimate betrayer, weaving herself into the lives of her victims before extinguishing them. The mask of Jolly Jane was still firmly in place, but cracks were beginning to show. Her ambition, her jealousy, and her growing recklessness were bringing her closer to exposure. And soon, suspicion would finally take root. For years, Jane Toppan's murders passed unnoticed, hidden beneath the veil of natural death. But by the turn of the century, her confidence had bred carelessness, and the whispers that once dissolved into nothing began to take shape as suspicion. It was the Davis family that finally unraveled her web of deception. After the death of her foster sister Elizabeth, Jane had moved in with the wealthy Davis household in Catawba, Massachusetts. At first, her presence was welcomed. She was a trusted nurse, a cheerful companion, and seemingly devoted to the family's well-being. But one by one, the Davises began to fall mysteriously ill. First came Alden Davis, the aging patriarch. He grew weak under Jane's care and died within weeks. His death, though tragic, did not seem unnatural. Then his wife, Maddie, soon followed, her health collapsing with eerie speed. Grief-stricken, the surviving daughters, Genevieve and Minnie, leaned on Jane for comfort, never suspecting that the very woman consoling them was also orchestrating their decline. Within months, Genevieve, too, was dead. Minnie soon followed. 4 members of the Davis family, gone in quick succession, all under Jane's watchful eye. This time, the coincidences were too sharp, too cruel. Relatives outside the household began to question how such a devastating string of deaths could strike one family. Doctors, too, started to notice patterns in Jane's nursing history. Patients who had been expected to recover mysteriously worsened whenever she was near. Whispers turned into reports. The Davises' surviving relatives demanded an investigation. Exhumations were ordered, a rare and serious step in that era. When Alden Davis's organs were tested, traces of poison were found. Though forensic science was still primitive, the evidence was damning enough to confirm what many had begun to suspect: foul play. Jane, once the beloved Jolly Jane, was now under scrutiny. Her history of being present at so many unexpected deaths suddenly looked sinister. The cheerful nurse had moved through households and hospitals, leaving a trail of corpses in her wake. By 1901, the net was closing. Detectives questioned her, piecing together testimony from surviving families and fellow nurses. At first, Jane denied wrongdoing, but her composure began to slip. Her stories contradicted, her explanations sounded hollow, and the weight of mounting evidence pressed harder. The woman who had hidden behind laughter and kindness for decades was finally exposed. For the first time, the deaths she had orchestrated were not invisible tragedies but recognized crimes. The investigation had pierced her disguise, and Jane Toppan's carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Next would come her capture, and the shocking confessions that stunned a nation. In the summer of 1901, the walls finally closed in on Jane Toppan. The investigation into the Davis family deaths left little room for doubt. Suspicion hardened into accusation, and soon Jane was arrested. The cheerful mask of Jolly Jane could no longer shield her. At first, she maintained her innocence, insisting she had only ever cared for her patients and friends. But behind closed doors, under the steady gaze of detectives and doctors, her facade began to crack. What followed shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Jane confessed, not to 1 or 2 murders, but to dozens. Calmly, almost casually, she admitted to killing at least 31 people. Though some believed the true number could have been far higher. She spoke of her methods with chilling detail, describing how she mixed morphine and atropine, how she watched her victims fade in and out of life, how she sometimes revived them just to prolong their suffering. But it wasn't the body count alone that stunned the authorities. It was the way she spoke about it. Jane expressed no remorse. In fact, she described the killings as pleasurable. She admitted that she derived an almost physical thrill from lying beside her victims as they died, holding them in her arms as if savoring the moment of ultimate control. Doctors and journalists alike were captivated and horrified. Here was a nurse, a woman entrusted with healing, openly admitting that her greatest joy came not from saving lives but from extinguishing them. She told one physician that her ambition had been to kill more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. The press seized on her story, painting her as both a monster and a fascination. Headlines dubbed her Jolly Jane, the nurse who laughed as she killed. Readers devoured every detail, shocked that such darkness could hide behind a friendly smile and a crisp white uniform. For investigators, her confession was both a breakthrough and a puzzle. Why confess so openly? Why boast about numbers that could never be fully proven? Some believed Jane's admissions were a mix of truth and exaggeration, her need for attention as strong as her compulsion to kill. Regardless, the damage was done. Jane Toppan had revealed herself to be not just a murderer, but a serial predator, unlike any America had ever seen. Her confession set the stage for one of the most sensational trials of the early 20th century. A courtroom drama where the question would not be whether she killed, but whether she could be held responsible for the horrors she so freely admitted. By late 1901, Jane Toppan's name had become synonymous with terror. The The newspapers branded her America's deadliest nurse, and crowds gathered outside courthouses just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had confessed to more than 30 murders. The trial promised drama, but it also carried a fundamental question. Was Jane evil, or was she insane? In the courtroom, Jane appeared calm, even cheerful. She smiled at spectators, chatted with her lawyers, and showed none of the remorse that might have softened her image. When witnesses described the mysterious deaths of patients and the string of tragedies in the Davis family, Jane listened attentively, sometimes even nodding, as though she were approving the details of her own story. The prosecution argued that Jane's confessions, her meticulous methods, and her deliberate choices proved she knew exactly what she was doing. She was not insane, they claimed. She was a calculating killer who had hidden behind a nurse's uniform for decades. But the defense countered with another narrative. They painted Jane as a woman tormented by delusions, driven by uncontrollable impulses, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. They leaned heavily on her bizarre statements, her admissions of pleasure at watching patients die, her boast that she wanted to kill more than anyone in history. To them, these were not the words of a rational murderer, but of a woman whose mind had fractured long ago. Psychiatrists were brought in to examine her. Their testimonies varied, but a consensus emerged. Jane Toppan was not sane. She suffered from what they then described as moral insanity, a term used to explain deviant behavior that lacked any apparent motive beyond gratification. In the end, the jury delivered its verdict. Jane Toppan was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of prison, she was committed to the Taunton Insane Hospital, where she would spend the rest of her life. The public reaction was a mix of outrage and fascination. Some believed justice had failed, that Jane had escaped true punishment. Others were captivated by the idea of a nurse-turned-predator, a woman who smiled while poisoning her closest friends. Whatever the opinion, one fact was undeniable. Jane Toppan had secured her place in history as one of the most chilling figures in American crime. After the verdict, Jane Toppan was transferred to the Taunton Insane Hospital in Massachusetts, a sprawling gray institution designed to hold society's most troubled souls. For many, confinement in such a place meant a life of misery and decline. But for Jane, it became yet another stage on which to perform her unsettling version of cheerfulness. Reports from attendants described her as calm and sociable. She would laugh, joke, and chat with staff and fellow patients alike, much as she had done in the hospitals where she once killed. To those who saw her daily, she seemed more like an eccentric aunt than a notorious murderer. Yet behind the light-hearted exterior, she continued to show not the faintest trace of remorse. Visitors and journalists occasionally sought her out, curious to see the infamous Jolly Jane. What struck them most was not wild-eyed madness, but her composure. She admitted freely to her crimes, but always without guilt, sometimes even with pride. When asked if she regretted her actions, she is said to have replied, "No, I liked it." Jane lived in the asylum for more than 3 decades, outlasting many who had committed her there. She grew old within its walls, her once lively presence settling into routine. Nurses and doctors who came and went often found it difficult to reconcile the frail, gray-haired woman before them with the monster who had confessed to dozens of murders. In 1938, Jane Toppan died at the age of 84. She left no final confession, no apology, no explanation. Just the same chilling silence that had followed her victims into the grave. Her death closed the final chapter of her life, but the legacy of her crimes was only beginning to cast its long shadow. Jane Toppan's death in 1938 ended her physical presence, but the echoes of her crimes lingered long after. In the early 20th century, her case left a deep scar on public trust, especially in the medical field. Nurses had always been seen as guardians of care, women whose presence brought comfort and healing. Jane shattered that image. If a smiling nurse could be a killer, then who could truly be trusted? Her story became a cautionary tale, whispered in hospitals and studied in criminology classes. She was not just a murderer, but one of the earliest documented examples of what later came to be known as an angel of death. Healthcare professionals who exploit their positions of trust to kill the very people they are meant to protect. Her case helped spark discussions about oversight in medical institutions, drug accountability, and the risks of unchecked access to powerful medications. Jane also forced society to confront the uncomfortable reality of female serial killers. At a time when women were often viewed as nurturing and passive, she embodied the opposite. Her crimes revealed that cruelty and domination were not bound by gender. For many, this was more frightening than the acts themselves, because it dismantled assumptions about who could be dangerous. In the years that followed, writers, criminologists, and journalists returned to Jane's story, trying to understand her motives and the psychology behind her killings. Was it envy, a hunger for power, a warped form of intimacy, or simply the joy of watching life slip away? The lack of clear answers only deepened her legend. Today, Jane Toppan remains a haunting figure in the annals of true crime, a reminder that evil can wear a smile, pour a glass of water, or hold your hand as you slip into death. Her legacy is not just her body count, but the chilling fear she left behind, that the ones we trust most may sometimes be the ones we should fear. To this day, Jane Toppan's motives remain as unsettling as her crimes. Unlike many killers who act out of greed, revenge, or even desperation, Jane seemed to kill for one reason alone: pleasure. Her confessions revealed not a woman weighed down by guilt, but one who reveled in control, in the delicate balance between life and death. Psychologists who later studied her case suggested she suffered from what was then called moral insanity, a profound lack of empathy combined with impulses she neither resisted nor regretted. Modern criminologists might recognize elements of psychopathy in her detached rationality, her manipulation of trust, and her chilling lack of remorse. But Jane's case is also layered with personal wounds: her abandonment as a child, her longing for legitimacy, her envy of those who had love and belonging. Some theorists argue that each killing was, in part, Jane striking back against the life she had been denied. Others believe her murders were less about rage and more about intimacy. She often spoke of lying beside her victims as they died, holding them close. For her, death was not just destruction. It was closeness, possession, ultimate dominance. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Jane's psychology is its ordinariness. She did not appear deranged. She was not reclusive, nor violent in public. She was witty, social, and trusted. The darkness that defined her was invisible until it was far too late. In the end, Jane Toppan forces us to face a truth we resist: that evil does not always arrive in grotesque or obvious forms. Sometimes it wears a smile, speaks kindly, and waits patiently at the bedside. And that is what makes her story endure, a chilling reminder of how easily monsters can hide in plain sight. Jane Toppan's story is more than a tale of crime. It is a chilling reminder of how darkness can hide behind the brightest of smiles. She was not the stranger in the alley or the shadow at the window. She was the nurse by the bedside, the friend at the table, the cheerful woman who seemed to brighten every room. And yet beneath that mask, she harbored one of the darkest compulsions in American history. Her legacy forces us to ask difficult questions. How well do we really know the people around us? How much trust do we place in those who hold power over our lives? And how often do we mistake charm for safety? Jane's crimes shook the foundations of trust in healthcare and remain a cautionary tale to this day. But beyond the history, her story endures because it touches a primal fear: the idea that those we rely on most may harbor the deepest betrayals. As we close this chapter on Jolly Jane, we're left with a reminder: monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they smile, they laugh, and they hold your hand while the life drains away. If you found this story as haunting as we did, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think drove Jane Toppan? Envy, madness, or pure pleasure and control? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more dark historical true crime, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next story we uncover from history's shadows. Because sometimes, the past holds the darkest secrets of all.